From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
To any woman who hears this story, this is not an unusual or uncommon story that when they were younger, some young boy, some young man decided that they had the right to throw them down and to try to take their clothes off. And I think that, I hope that in this year of Me Too, that we've come far enough now to take this very, very seriously.
Today, Oscar-winning filmmaker Michael Moore on Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's allegations that Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh attempted to rape her as a teenager. She wants the FBI to investigate her claims before she testifies to the Senate. Moore's new film, Fahrenheit 11/9, about President Trump and much more, is out this week. We'll also discuss Kavanaugh's nomination, now up in the air, with Reverend Dr. William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign.
We know that when the courts have been wrong in this country, and there have been many times, that it has turned us backwards rather than forward. In the light of this, there must be a moral fight to keep Kavanaugh off the Supreme Court.
Reverend Barber will join us from North Carolina, where President Trump heads today to survey massive flood damage from Hurricane Florence. Barber says in the hurricane wind and waves, the poor suffer most. Then the Trump administration slashes the refugee admissions cap to a historic low of 30,000 refugees per year.
The improved refugee policy of this administration serves the national interest of the United States and expands our ability to help those in need all around the world. We will continue to assist the world's most vulnerable while never losing sight of our first duty, serving the American people.
Amnesty International says the new refugee cap means more people fleeing violence, religious persecution, and armed conflict could die. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The leaders of North and South Korea have wrapped up their third summit this year with a vow to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. Earlier today, South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un held a joint news conference in Pyongyang. Kim vowed to move towards denuclearization if the United States takes steps of its own.
We adopted a military pact to end a history of brutal and tragic confrontation and hostility, and agreed to make efforts to turn the Korean peninsula into a land of peace without nuclear weapons and nuclear threats.
South Korean President Moon Jae-in praised the North Korean offer. He said the era of no war has started.
South and North Korea agreed on a denuclearization plan for the first time. It is a very meaningful outcome. The North has decided to permanently abolish the Tongchanri engine test site and missile launchers with the attendance of experts from relevant countries.
The two leaders also agreed to pursue a bid to co-host the 2032 Olympic Games, and Moon said he expects Kim Jong-un to soon become the first North Korean leader to ever visit Seoul. The woman who's accused Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh of attempting to rape her as a teenager has asked for the FBI to investigate her claims before she testifies to the Senate. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Chuck Grassley had invited the woman, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, and Kavanaugh to both testify Monday. In a letter to Grassley, Blasey Ford's attorneys wrote, quote, "While Dr. Ford's life was being turned upside down, you and your staff scheduled a public hearing for her to testify at the same table as Judge Kavanaugh in front of 24 U.S. senators on national television to relive this traumatic and harrowing incident." The letter went on to reveal Christine Blasey Ford has received multiple death threats in the past few days and has been forced to move her family out of her home. On Tuesday night, one of her attorneys, Lisa Banks, appeared on CNN.
Any talk of a hearing on Monday, frankly, is premature because she just came forward with these allegations 48 hours ago. And since that time, she has been dealing with hate mail, harassment, death threats. So she's been spending her time trying to figure out how to put her life back together how to protect herself and her family. And there hasn't been an investigation, and these are serious allegations.
On Tuesday night, Senator Grassley said there's no reason for any further delay of the hearing, even if Dr. Christine Blasey Ford does not testify. Meanwhile, President Trump dismissed the need for an FBI probe into her allegations.
To that end, what would be the problem with the FBI reopening their background investigation into Judge Kavanaugh? Would you support such a thing?
It wouldn't bother me, other than the FBI, John, said that they really don't do that. That's not what they do.
Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein of California responded on Twitter by writing, quote, "Fact check. The FBI can investigate Dr. Blasey Ford's allegations as part of its background investigation. That's their job. To say otherwise is false. It investigated Anita Hill's allegations of sexual harassment against Clarence Thomas. It should investigate this, too," Feinstein tweeted. President Trump also defended Brett Kavanaugh, describing him as a great gentleman.
I feel so badly for him that he's going through this, to be honest with you. I feel so badly for him. This is not a man that deserves this. And we will see what happens. But I just think he is at a level that we rarely see, not only in government, anywhere in life. And honestly, I feel terribly for him, for his wife, who is an incredible, lovely woman, and for his beautiful young daughters. I feel terribly for them.
President Trump did not refer to Kavanaugh's accuser by name, just calling her the woman. The death toll from Hurricane Florence has risen to 35, while the flooding is worsening in some parts of North Carolina. President Trump is heading to North Carolina today, where some 10,000 people are still living in shelters and nearly 350,000 are without power. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, 2 women detainees died Tuesday when they were being transported in a sheriff's van, which was overcome by floodwaters. The women were both mental health patients being detained for medical transport. 2 sheriff's deputies in the vehicle were able to be rescued from the rising waters. We'll have more on Hurricane Florence later in the program with the Reverend Dr. Barber. President Trump has confirmed the United States is considering building a permanent U.S. military base in Poland.
We're looking at it very seriously. I know Poland likes the idea very much, and it's something that we are considering, yes.
Trump made the comment during a White House meeting with the Polish President Duda, suggested naming the base Fort Trump. Poland has been pushing for an increased U.S. presence as a counter to what it has described as Russian aggression in the region. In other military news, Stars and Stripes is reporting the U.S.-led international coalition in Afghanistan is building new, hardened, permanent structures in Kabul. In the latest sign, the 17-year war won't be ending anytime soon. NATO is seeking bids to build a massive concrete command and control center at its compound. In news from Yemen, U.S.-backed Saudi forces have launched a new series of attacks on the port city of Hodeidah, sparking fears of a humanitarian crisis. The charity Save the Children has warned disruption to supplies coming through Hodeidah could, quote, cause starvation on an unprecedented scale. The group warns 5 million children are at risk of famine. Meanwhile, CNN's reporting new evidence confirms U.S.-made bombs have been used in a series of attacks killing Yemeni civilians since the U.S.-backed Saudi assault began in 2015. The CNN probe was based on shrapnel found at the scene of multiple bombings. Several of the bombs were manufactured by Raytheon. In Gaza, Israeli forces killed 2 Palestinians Tuesday and wounded 46, firing shots at a crowd of thousands protesting near the Erez checkpoint border fence with Israel. The protest was in part calling out the recent halt in funding by the U.S. to the UN agency UNRWA. Meanwhile, Israeli forces shot and killed a Palestinian man in the occupied East Jerusalem. A new UN report is slamming Burma's leadership for the mass atrocities committed against the Rohingya minority. The report details violence in the western state of Rakhine and finds that the Burmese military committed, quote, the gravest crimes under international law when Rohingya villages were cleared a year ago. The report builds on an earlier UN report from August, which called for top Burmese military leaders to be prosecuted for crimes against humanity and genocide. A top UN human rights investigator also called out Burma's civilian leader, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, for being a, quote, fig leaf for military atrocities. This is Marzuki Darusman, chair of the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar.
Repressive laws are being used to silence those that seek to scrutinize. We have verified instances of reprisals against individuals for sharing information with the United Nations. Peaceful protests are blocked, sometimes violently, as occurred in the village of Mrauk-U, while voices critical of the government are muted by threats and arrest. Hate speech is thriving, particularly against the Rohingya. Patience will not help Myanmar's democratization. It will only help those that seek to derail it, as it has for over 70 years.
China hit back at President Trump's recently announced tariffs on the country by confirming its planned tariffs on $60 billion worth of U.S. products. The tariff rates were lowered from previous proposals and continues the ongoing trade war between the two nations. In response, President Trump warned he may impose additional tariffs on all remaining Chinese goods. A member of the Russian activist group Pussy Riot remains hospitalized in Berlin after losing the ability to speak or walk. On Tuesday, German doctors said the activist, Piotr Verzilov, was likely poisoned. He was hospitalized last week after falling gravely ill. In July, he was arrested and jailed after rushing the field during a World Cup match to protest Russian police brutality and human rights abuses. He reportedly started having severe symptoms after attending a court hearing in Moscow. In 2012, Piotr appeared on Democracy Now! To talk about Russia's jailing of his former wife, Nadia Tolokonnikova, also of Pussy Riot.
A week later, I went to see Nadia, and around 20 or 25 FSB officers just were jumping out of nowhere and apprehended us. We were put to the ground, guns stuck to our heads, and then we were taken to interrogation. And the same thing happened with other two girls.
That's Piotr Verzilov. He remains hospitalized in Berlin. That interview from 2012. You can go to the whole interview at democracynow.org. In voting rights news, Mother Jones reports Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross lied under oath in testimony about the controversial citizenship question in the 2020 census. Ross claimed the Justice Department requested the addition of the question in order to better enforce the Voting Rights Act, but new emails confirm he was the one who approached the Justice Department about including the controversial question after consulting with senior White House officials. Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, then head of the widely discredited and now defunct Election Integrity Commission, was one of the officials who lobbied Ross to add the question, quote, at the direction of Steve Bannon, unquote. Multiple lawsuits are challenging the inclusion of the citizenship question in the census. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn, New York, has agreed to pay out $27.5 million to 4 men who were sexually abused by a religious teacher between 2003 and 2009. It's one of the largest settlements ever awarded to individual abuse victims within the Catholic Church. And McDonald's workers around the country went on strike against the fast food giant Tuesday to protest sexual harassment. At rallies in various cities, workers decried sexual abuse and harassment in the workplace and said the company has not addressed their complaints in many cases. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who has accused Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh of attempting to rape her when she was 15, has asked for the FBI to investigate her claims before she testifies to the Senate. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Chuck Grassley had invited Blasey Ford and Kavanaugh to both testify on Monday, But in a letter to Grassley, Blasey Ford's attorneys wrote, quote, "While Dr. Ford's life was being turned upside down, you and your staff scheduled a public hearing for her to testify at the same table as Judge Kavanaugh in front of 24 U.S. senators on national television to relive this traumatic and harrowing incident." The letter went on to reveal Christine Blasey Ford has received multiple death threats in the past few days and has been forced to move out of her home. On Tuesday night, one of her attorneys, Lisa Banks, appeared on CNN.
Any talk of a hearing on Monday, frankly, is premature because she just came forward with these allegations 48 hours ago. And since that time, she has been dealing with hate mail, harassment, death threats. So she's been spending her time trying to figure out how to put her life back together, how to protect herself and her family. And there hasn't been an investigation, and these are serious allegations.
On Tuesday night, Senator Grassley said there's no reason for any further delay in the hearing, even if Christine Blasey Ford doesn't testify. Meanwhile, President Trump dismissed the need for an FBI probe into her allegations.
To that end, what would be the problem with the FBI reopening their background investigation into Judge Kavanaugh? Would you support such a thing?
It wouldn't bother me other than the FBI, John, said that they really don't do that. That's not what they do.
Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein of California responded on Twitter by writing, "Fact check. The FBI can investigate Dr. Blasey Ford's allegations as part of its background investigation. That is their job. To say otherwise is false. It investigated Anita Hill's allegations of sexual harassment against Clarence Thomas. It should investigate this, too." President Trump also defended Kavanaugh, describing him as a great gentleman.
I feel so badly for him that he's going through this, to be honest with you. I feel so badly for him. This is not a man that deserves this. And we will see what happens. But I just think he is at a level that we rarely see, not only in government, anywhere in life. And honestly, I feel terribly for him, for his wife, who is an incredible, lovely woman, and for his beautiful young daughters. I feel terribly for them.
President Trump himself has been accused of sexual assault and harassment by multiple women. In that news conference, he would not refer to Dr. Blasey Ford by name, only as the woman. Well, on Tuesday evening, I sat down with Oscar-winning filmmaker Michael Moore, whose new film about Trump and much more is out this week. It's called Fahrenheit 11/9, Tyrant, Liar, Racist, a Hole in One. He was here in our New York studio, and I asked him to respond to Trump's comments about Kavanaugh and, as well, Kavanaugh's accuser, Christine Blasey Ford.
I watched the news this morning, and to hear her say, as she's described in the Washington Post article, she described the incident, that when he had thrown her on the bed, and he at that point is a 17-year-old junior or senior in high school. She's a 15-year-old freshman or sophomore. And she said, and I think I'm quoting accurately here, that the thought ran through her head that she could possibly die because he was suffocating her with his hand over her mouth and nose. I guess as you have to say legally here, as it is alleged.
Because she was attempting to scream.
Because she was trying to scream. And
allegedly.
Yes. I was never a teenage girl. But I have had to live my 64 years listening to women, both friends, family, and the general public tell me these stories. This is, I think, to any woman who hears this story, this is not an unusual or uncommon story, that when they were younger, some young boy, some young man decided that they had the right to throw them down and to try to take their clothes off. And And I think that, I hope that in this year of Me Too, that we've come far enough now to take this very, very seriously. I don't like at all the way that they're trying to rush this through. I think this is a real watershed moment, frankly. And while we all still believe, I hope we believe, that everyone is innocent until proven guilty, that any woman who comes forward with an allegation like this has to be listened to. And you cannot say, oh, it was just high school. He was 17 years old. How many 17-year-olds do we have in prison now? Usually people of color. But they try them as adults. To just try to slough this off, to not have a real investigation, this thing has to be postponed. Separate from that, a president who is under criminal investigation, possibly for treason, has no rights to appoint anyone or nominate anyone to the Supreme Court. Can we all just agree on that? But now that Dr. Ford has come forward with this, to ignore her, to not listen to her, that will be its own crime. And I sincerely hope, as we sit here today, and as in the coming days and weeks, that somehow this has to be tabled. There's no way they can go forward with this now. And I don't know. I guess I don't know. I feel for everybody that has told me a story like this that I've listened to for the last 40 years. And I got to tell you too, as you know, as a guy who was a teenager, as a guy who was a tween, just so you know, guys like me have had to put up with these guys since we were in junior high school. You know, I don't know what words I can use on this show, but basically these assholes that we've had to tolerate and who have made life miserable for us and who were the bullies when we were in school. And their belief that they have a right to use their strength for violence to get their way. This is nothing new to us as men and the men that we have had to deal with since we were that age. So none of this is surprising. Everyone has felt it or been affected by it, but especially the women who've had to tolerate this their entire lives. And I know that when I walk out of here, if we were doing this at night, and it was 10 o'clock and we're downtown here in New York City, it's 10 o'clock at night and it's dark out, I would walk out of your building here and walk to the subway and go home and really never have another thought about it, because I belong to this gender. But if you belong to the other gender, you can't just walk out of here at 10 o'clock at night. You have an invisible radar, like those TV news vans. A thing goes up where you have to watch, and you have to be careful, because you know what could possibly happen. I don't know if most men actually realize that they have to, that we've got to live our entire adult lives really never having to worry about who's coming at us down the street or whatever, because we belong to this gender. And if you see a woman on a dark street walking towards you at night, never once do you think, oh, I could be in some danger here. You know, I could be, because that's not the gender that does that. When you first heard that there was someone, I remember I was watching CNN, they broke in, and they said there was a man on top of that hotel in Las Vegas firing on a crowd of 20,000 people. And they said the word man, but they said they didn't know who was up there doing it, and they didn't know how many there were. But they gendered it. Of course they did, because everybody knows there's no woman up there with machine guns firing on a crowd of people. That you don't have to worry about 51% of the population that is not going to jump out of the bushes and mug you or commit acts of violence against you. That's just the truth. Everybody knows it's the truth. We never talk about the gender aspect of this. The CDC has wanted to study it. The NRA has kept them in Congress from studying the gender aspect of violence in our society. To me, it's always been, if you're watching the 11 o'clock news and you hear that a woman has actually shot a guy, what's your first thought? Well, what did he do? What kind of abusive guy is that? We know. I mean, it's like, for a woman to do that, that's the society we live in. So Brett Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford now bring one of the big central issues and way of living in our society now to the table again. And we're going to have to confront it and deal with it. And I hope we do. But either way, the criminal president doesn't have a right to be making appointments to the Supreme Court.
That's Oscar-winning filmmaker Michael Moore commenting on Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's allegations that Brett Kavanaugh tried to rape her when she was 15 years old and he's 17. Michael Moore's new film about Trump and much more is out this week. It's called Fahrenheit 11/9. Michael Moore joined us here in our New York studio. We'll air more of his interview later this week. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we head to North Carolina to speak with Reverend Barber about the hurricane and the effects on the poor. Stay with us.
She said, no more free low. This is the end of the freak show. Half shaved and heart broke, half slewed, half snapped the rat trap, snapping back. Hand bone, hand me down, bologna sandwich, slowly clown, smoke, laugh, choke, crabs, horn, blood, kiss, grass, kiss, miss, heart, hand, tried to take a stand down, drop, sails low, the joys and woes, the curtain slowly close. Raging, death dice fall, hot house burned down, foes upon foes, west to east it goes, the dead girl says, let's just be friends, in the glorious tone of marrow and bone, these days of ore, the chance we meet once more, the smoke, lightning, crack.
Smoke 'Em Out by Coco Rosie featuring Anoni. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're going to turn right now to the Reverend William Barber. We're speaking to him in North Carolina, and we originally had him on to talk about the hurricane. But before we go to that, Dr. William Barber, I wanted to ask you about Judge Kavanaugh. You held a news conference opposing Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court well before Dr. Blasey Ford spoke out and said that he had attempted to rape her when they were both teenagers. I was wondering if you would share your thoughts at this point, both on this latest controversy and why you're so vehemently opposed to Judge Kavanaugh taking a seat on the Supreme Court.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for this opportunity. Before all of the latest news, Judge Kavanaugh, first of all, was being put forward after McConnell and the Senate held open a seat for over 420 days in a way that we had not seen since the Civil War. They literally denied a president his right to nominate someone and for them to have a hearing. This was the same Judiciary Committee that denied 2 African-American women a hearing to be appointed to the federal court, 1st District, Eastern District in North Carolina. So the process was bad from the beginning. Secondly, what we are seeing now, if we look at George Bush and now Donald Trump, we are poised to have 2 presidents that did not win the popular vote now will have appointed 4 members to the Supreme Court, 4 extreme members to the Supreme Court. We already have a Supreme Court that rolled back the Voting Rights Act. Kavanaugh, we believe it would be dangerous to voting rights, to labor rights, to health care, and to women's rights. And that was exposed in the hearings of what he would not answer and what he would not say was settled law. For instance, Senator Kamala Harris asked him, was Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act settled law? Section 2 says it's basically the protection that says no state can engage in discriminatory practices as it relates to voting and voting rights. He did not answer that question. He could not even say yes on something as fundamental as voting rights. So he was a dangerous, if you will, nominee already. Now that this has come out, and I've been thinking about it in a number of ways. Number one, this lady did not intend to come out. Dr. Ford, it was leaked. And she has asked for a FBI investigation. That's strange for someone that the extremists who call them Republicans are trying to say she's lying. But be it as it may, it's all alleged. I heard Michael Moore mention a minute ago about the feminist side of this, the woman side of this agenda. Let me flip this over. Imagine Obama nominating a black or a Latino man for the Supreme Court, and an accusation comes up that black or Latino man had attempted to rape a teenage girl. Imagine that for a minute, and imagine what the Republicans would be doing if, in fact, that was the scene that we're dealing with now. Here they are having a white man for the Supreme Court nominee accused of attempting to rape a white woman, and they are already forming an opinion and wanting to refuse to even give her an FBI investigation. This is nothing but the gangsterization of our politics and our political systems, and people in America must stand up against this entire process because it is contrary to our fundamental values.
Well, I wanted to turn right now, Reverend Barber, to what you're dealing with in North Carolina, to look at how thousands continue to evacuate North Carolina in the wake of Hurricane Florence, now a tropical depression, which has caused record flooding since it made landfall 5 days ago. President Trump is expected to visit your state, is going to North and South Carolina today. The death toll from the storm has risen to at least 35, including 3 young children, and as well in South Carolina, 2 women detainees drown in a sheriff's van. More than 10,000 people have already fled to shelters. Nearly 400,000 are without power in North Carolina. On Tuesday, Governor Roy Cooper said 16 rivers were at major flood stage, and 3 more rivers could peak in coming days. Massive industrial coal ash landfills and pig and chicken farms have also been engulfed by the floodwaters, and millions of chickens and pigs have drowned. The Associated Press reports at least 45 active farms are located in the floodplain. Crystal Coast waterkeeper Larry Baldwin flew over eastern North Carolina and described the damage to hog and chicken farms.
We did see a couple of facilities today that were already in serious trouble. They were surrounded by water. Their lagoons were surrounded by water. Their spray fields were completely covered up. The situation is not good, but it's not good today, but it's likely to get much worse throughout the rest of the week as these waters start to get to their flood levels.
More than 1.4 million people in North Carolina are now without functioning water systems, and even more have been ordered to boil their water. The areas devastated by Hurricane Florence include some of the poorest areas on the eastern seaboard. In some counties, nearly 1 in 3 people live below the poverty line. For more, we continue to speak with Reverend Dr. William Barber, who's co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. He's in Raleigh, North Carolina, distinguished visiting professor of public theology at Union Theological Seminary, former president of North Carolina NAACP and Moral Mondays leader. Recently wrote a piece for CNN headlined, "In Hurricane Wind and Waves, the Poor Suffer Most." So describe what's happening on the ground, Dr. Barber, in your state.
Well, I'm actually, if you're right, in Raleigh, and headed back to Goldsboro, where my church, Greenleaf Christian Church, and also Repairs of the Breach, we're planning to feed children who many of them are missing meals because the schools are closed, because the rivers, even in my city, have not crested yet. We don't know what this flood will cause. In Fayetteville, it's over, they're talking about 61 feet, some 15 to 20 feet higher than it was when Hurricane Mitchell came. That gave us a 500-year flood across the state. Amy, here's what we have to help people to understand. And Trump is coming, for instance, to visit today, but his policies, the negative impact of his policy, were visited on the poor and low wealth long before he came. We are in a state before the hurricane, poor people and low wealth people had a storm. There are over 4.7 million residents in North Carolina that are poor and low wealth. There are over 1 million people in North Carolina before the storm that did not have health care. The counties that are being hit the hardest, Amy, are Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1 is the most distressed county in terms of housing, health care, and poverty, and Tier 2 is the next level. They are being hit the hardest. In North Carolina, 2 million workers make under $15 an hour, and it would take a person making $7 an hour, they'd have to work some 80-some hours just to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. That's what existed before the hurricane. 48% of people in North Carolina are poor and low income. That's what existed before the hurricane. And we have an extremist Republican-led legislature that refused to expand Medicaid, which meant 500,000 people in our state could have health care right now, and they don't have it. The Republican Congress is talking about cutting SNAP. People need those food stamps now more than ever after this flood. We refuse a living wage. Many of the people who are flooded, they work hourly jobs. They're not getting paid now. When people, they don't have the resources. When the governor and others said evacuate, they couldn't evacuate because they don't have the money. They don't have the cars. They did not have the ability. And when you think about it, the state is now bringing federal money. The president will say he's going to give federal money. But this state has refused federal money that would have helped the poor prior to the storm so that they would have buffers against the storm. So we have 2 hurricanes. The hurricane of poverty and lack of health care and lack of living wages that existed prior to the storm. And then we have the storm, and now everything that was already tough for people has been exacerbated. That's the story we must keep our eyes on, because some people are looking at what happened on the coast. We actually dodged a bullet on the coast. But if you come inland now and see these rivers that are where mostly the poor live, along these rivers and in these rural communities, they are being devastated. And when you add to that, lastly, Amy, the environmental devastation, the coal ash, the hog farms, the bacteria, the poison that's being put in the water table and put in the rivers, this is a catastrophe, a tremendous catastrophe, but some of it could have been buffered, could have been made better if our state, particularly and people in Congress, would help the poor in advance of this storm, would make sure everybody has health care and living wages. And we had cleaned up these coal ashes and coal ash ponds, and we stopped using fossil fuel. If those kinds of things would happen in advance of storms, there wouldn't be so much damage to the poor and the least of these after the storm.
Well, speaking of poverty, I wanted to read a letter from a resident of Edenton, North Carolina, who wrote to the New York Times this week, quote, "Unfortunately, my family does not have the resources to put gas in our vehicle. I myself came here to the city to care for my father, who was diagnosed with cancer, with next to nothing to my name. We have no way out, so we're staying. We live together in a double-wide trailer. That's one letter. And then I want to turn to the small town of Princeville in eastern North Carolina, the first town chartered by freed slaves in the United States in 1885. Originally known as Freedom Hill, sits on an unwanted floodplain along the Tar River that's flooded many times. The town's website notes, quote, flooding like the threat of white supremacy has plagued Princeville since its settlement. Major floods occurred 2 years after the community's founding and again in 1919, 1924, 1928, 1940, and 58. The Army Corps of Engineers eventually built a dike that helped reduce the flooding, but in 1999, heavy rains from Hurricane Floyd submerged parts of Princeville under 23 feet of water for more than a week. This is Princeville resident Linda Worsley speaking to the New York Times about how she was displaced from her home by flooding after Hurricane Matthew caused widespread damage in the town in 2016.
We did have a dike buildup, but the water actually went around the dike and it came up behind my house and destroyed everything. Then a lot of the water also came up through the sewer systems.
Are you worried about whether or not you'll be allowed to rebuild on this land?
Yes, I am. Trying to do everything I can to make sure I'll still be able to stay in the same land that my forefathers bought so that we could have somewhere to live and go.
So that clip from Princeville, a 2016 report, talking about the black community, the first community founded by freed slaves. Can you talk more about this, Reverend Barber?
I actually did a rededication of that city this past year, and I know people there. I live not far from Princeville. I live in eastern North Carolina. I've raised in eastern North Carolina. So this is my home that I'm seeing constantly hit. We know about what happened in Matthew and Floyd. It literally devastated. I think something like a 15-foot wall of water came through that area. It actually set the pews inside of churches all the way up, had them standing up inside of the church. The water was that powerful, and people lost their lives. Again, but since that flood, it was after that North Carolina's extremist politician said, we don't need health care. We don't need a living wage. We don't need to deal with these environmental issues. If anything, they deregulated. And here we are again. We're in a state where 56% of the children, Amy, 1.3 million, are poor and low wealth. 62% of people of color, 2.3 million, are poor and low wealth. But this is something people also don't know. The majority of the poor people in North Carolina are white. And even in eastern North Carolina, while those counties are the counties with the highest percentages of African Americans, the majority of the people in those counties are white, and the majority of the people who are poor are white. And so it's a race question and a class question. It's a denial question. It's a question that after these storms normally happen, people go back to business as usual. Or we get something like we see the extremism of Trump, where you deny the things that people need. Then when the storm hits, you come in and you visit and act as though you're concerned, but your policies prior to the storms created problems for the people in a way that they wouldn't have some of these problems they have now if you hadn't been so vicious and so mean and so regressive in your policies when the days were sunny. We're going to have to learn how to do this better. People are suffering. People are afraid all over eastern North Carolina. And think about this, Amy. This is the only glimmer of sunshine in the midst of this. This is what a Category 1 and a tropical storm has done. They thought it would be a Category 4 or 3. If it had been a Category 3 or 4, it is unimaginable what the pain and the travesty would be, what the poisoning to the environment would be, what the need for health care would be. Imagine now people that are getting sick that could have health care don't have it. How are they going to be treated? Homes, as you said, you talked about a lady living in a mobile home. There's so many mobile homes. We could do so much better with affordable housing in these areas, but that's not the case. Some people may be off work 2 and 3 weeks. They already were in a position before the storm where if they missed one day, they might not be able to pay their rent or afford their medicine or feed their families. We have to talk about the political and social storms that exacerbate the natural storms when they do happen.
Just last month, former Vice President Al Gore visited you in North Carolina, and you went on a tour of the coal-impacted communities. Gore speaking here in front of the smokestacks of Duke Energy's Belews Creek Steam Station, which runs on coal.
I want to draw connections between Belews Lake and the coal ash pollution and the gaseous pollution that is threatening to make of our entire planet the kind of mess that they've made here. We had to stop on the way over here or actually we didn't stop, but we saw going beside us all these train cars full of coal. On a peak day, this plant over here burns 220 rail cars full of coal. And what is left over when they burn it is this toxic coal ash. Now, if you had all these millions of tons of a toxic substance, and you just dug a raw gash in the ground and dumped it in there, you would be behaving recklessly.
That's right.
That's what they're doing.
That's right.
This is a crime scene.
So that's Vice President Al Gore speaking outside the Duke Energy plant with you, Reverend Barber. Duke Energy, and that was before the storm. Duke Energy now says at least 2,000 cubic yards of coal ash were released amidst Tropical Depression Florence's massive flooding in North Carolina, enough ash to fill something like 180 dump trucks. As we wrap up what this means.
And one of those areas is in Goldsboro. It's in the Neuse River. It's one of the sites that was already leaking that people have been fighting. And they tell us all the time the coal ash is not poison. And we say, well, then why isn't it in the rich communities? Why isn't it in the communities of the politicians? It is poisonous. It is dangerous. It was already leaking. It was already broken. It was already messed up. The storm has exacerbated this, and it did not have to be this way. Duke, the very company that's now having to send people out to help turn on power, is the same company that has negatively impacted poor communities by placing all of these coal ash ponds and coal ash sites in and around poor communities, in and around sources of water. It is a form of hypocrisy. On one hand, to say we want to help you after the storm, but then but before the storm, we engage in policies that continually hurt and harm the poor, the low wealth, and the least of us.
Well, we want to thank you so much, Reverend Dr. William Barber, and also, of course, with President Trump coming to the Carolinas today, he proudly denies climate change, calls it a Chinese hoax. In the last 10 seconds, what would you say to him about this?
I would say to him with my son, who's an environmentalist lawyer and also an environmentalist physicist, because of the warming air, it's messing up the jet streams. Therefore, what you have is this erratic hurricanes. They twist and turn and stop and move, and that means they dump more water. That means they hold more water. That means they're more powerful. Anybody who denies climate change is a fool. In this, and it is foolish to do it, because your denial of climate change, your denial of health care, your denial of living wages, your denial of environmental protection devastates the poor before storms ever come, and then there is an additional devastation on top of it.
We want to thank you so much, Reverend Dr. William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina. We'll link to your piece at CNN and Hurricane Wind and Waves. The poor suffer most. And interesting, you talked about your son, as Vice President Al Gore brought his daughter Karenna, a well-known environmentalist, also at Union Theological. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the Trump administration placing the most severe cap on refugees in history. Stay with us.
My people, bolo moi sunu dolen, bolo na. mooy seen door alhamdulillah sant yàlla ey xeexoobe matu ko file doom yaay sooy bolo
Unity by Diali Sissoko and Kiraba. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the Trump administration has once again slashed the number of refugees allowed to resettle in the United States. On Monday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the new cap on refugees would be historically low of just 30,000 next year, down from the current level of 45,000.
The improved refugee policy of this administration serves the national interest of the United States and expands our ability to help those in need all around the world. We will continue to assist the world's most vulnerable while never losing sight of our first duty, serving the American people. We are and continue to be the most generous nation in the world.
The actual number of refugees allowed into the country is expected to be even lower than the 30,000 cap. Monday's announcement represents the lowest ceiling any president has imposed on the U.S. refugee program since its creation in 1980. Under President Obama, the refugee cap reached 110,000.
Well, for more on the Trump administration's refugee policy, we go to Washington, D.C. to speak with Ryan Mace, refugee specialist for Amnesty International USA. Ryan, thanks for joining us. Talk about the significance of this number and what it means for refugees around the world.
Yes, thank you so much for having us on. It's an honor to be on. Yeah, this really is quite significant, the announcement that the Secretary made on Monday. It really is, we're calling it an abandonment of our commitment to this vital protection. The U.S. Refugee Admissions Program is a program that was started in the 1980 Refugee Act. It's a bipartisan program. It's a program that we should all be very proud of. Over 3 million refugees have been resettled through this program since 1980. And as you said, presidents from Ronald Reagan, George Bush, President Obama have set the refugee admissions goal at the start of every fiscal year, and it's a goal that both shows our commitment to this vital protection. It shows our commitment as the United States, and it really does show the world that we are committed to this program. As you said, in the last full year of the Obama administration, in fiscal year 2016, they set the goal at 85,000. At the time, that actually was quite a high goal to set. Previously, the goal had been around 70,000. So and as you might recall, this was during the time, we're still in this time, but where Syrian refugees were obviously really on the front page of the news. There was a lot of political pressure for the United States and other countries to do more. And President Obama and the administration realized that. They set a goal that was definitely a higher goal than there had been. But the political will was there to say, we are going to do this, and that meant that they had to do the work to achieve that goal. We had to send people to do interviews on the ground, those security interviews that are so important, and we achieved that goal. It was 85,000, just a little under that, but they did meet that goal, and that's really the difference between previous administrations and the current one that we're in. Is that previous administrations set that goal at the start of the fiscal year in consultation with Congress and the American people, and they set that goal, and then they worked to achieve it throughout the year. And the difference is that at the start of this fiscal year, the one that we're in, the Trump administration set a goal of 45,000. At the time, that was the worst goal, that the lowest goal that any administration had ever set. And unfortunately, there has been really no effort to try and reach even half of that goal. We're a few short weeks away from the end of this fiscal year, and I just looked it up before I came in. We're about 21,000 refugees through the course of this last year who have been able to be resettled here in the U.S. And again, that's half of the goal that we set. And that is so unfortunate. That leaves behind families who are seeking to be reunited with relatives here in the U.S. It leaves behind people who urgently need medical attention. It leaves behind people who are real risk of their life or their well-being in the countries in which they're in. So,
Ryan, if I can ask you, in terms of the admissions and resettlement, could you talk about what countries the large bulk of the refugees are coming from now, let's say during the Trump administration? Has there been any change from under the Obama administration in terms of the countries from which people are coming?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you look at the difference in the past few years, you really can see, of course, every country has gone down, unfortunately, simply because of course, the goal has lowered so significantly in the past 2 years of this Trump administration. You're also seeing that, again, there's only a few countries where you're really seeing over a couple of thousand refugees even coming. Most countries in this fiscal year are in the hundreds because, again, we're talking about such a low number compared to previous fiscal years. I think one of the most stark numbers is, of course, for Syrian refugees. The Syrian refugee crisis, of course, everyone knows it's one of the worst refugee crises that we've faced. There's millions of refugees who have been forced to flee Syria, usually to the surrounding region. Jordan, Lebanon, other countries really do host a significant amount. It will be shocking, but the United States this year has only accepted 60 Syrian refugees this year, a shocking number. Last year, there was around 6,000 that were resettled, and primarily probably in the first few months of the fiscal year when Obama was still the president. And the last full year of President Obama's administration, there were almost 12,000 Syrians who were resettled here in the U.S.
And could you clarify the difference between the refugees admitted and asylum seekers?
Yeah, that's a really important question and distinction. So refugees, especially when you view it in the U.S. context, but refugees are people who come in the U.S. through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. So they're people who have fled their country of origin because of fear of persecution based on who they are or what they believe. And then they go through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. Usually they're referred by the United Nations. They've gone through the United Nations' own vetting and biometric process. And then once the UN refers them to the U.S. for resettlement, because the UN believes that they would be well placed in the U.S. because of either a family connection, a U.S. tie, or because we have, of course, the ability to accept them. The U.S. is historically received the largest amount. They go through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. Asylees are people, again, in a U.S. context, are people who come to our border, or maybe they came on through some other means, a student visa, and then they realize that while they're here, that they fear going back. Maybe there's a war that breaks out in their country, or maybe they get threats against their life. Or
Ryan, we have to wrap up, but we just want to
ask,
do you believe people will die if this cap is enforced?
Yes, unfortunately, this is very much a matter of life and death. These are people who are, again, they're all over the world, and there's people who urgently need access to this durable protection.
The Trump administration received so much backlash to Pompeo's announcement that the State Department said they're just bringing this proposal to Congress that hasn't been fully decided yet. So we will continue to follow this issue. Ryan Mace, refugee specialist for Amnesty International USA, thanks so much for joining us. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now!, produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.